She had always been quiet. In a small corner of the busy office, she moved almost like a shadow, doing her work without seeking attention or recognition. People came and went around her, chatting, laughing, sometimes complaining about deadlines or arguing over small mistakes. She just kept working. Her name was Lena, and no one really noticed her much. Not because she was invisible, but because she had a way of blending in, never making waves, never demanding help, and never complaining. Her hands were always full of papers, her eyes always focused on her screen or on organizing files that no one else seemed to care about. Lena's life outside the office was much harder than it appeared. Most of her co-workers assumed she lived a normal life, maybe a small apartment or a modest house. They had no idea she was barely making ends meet. She shared a tiny room in a crowded neighborhood with her grandmother, who was often sick. Every penny Lena earned went into rent, groceries, medicines, and anything else that her grandmother might need. She did not complain about it, nor did she ever talk about it. She was quiet, yes, but she carried a world of responsibility on her small shoulders. Every day at work was a challenge in its own way. The office was big, filled with people who were ambitious, loud, and always eager to be noticed. Lena didn't compete for attention. She didn't argue in meetings or try to make people like her. She just did her work. She helped organize files, prepared reports, managed schedules, and did the tasks that nobody else wanted to do. Sometimes people ignored her. Sometimes they took her work for granted, but she never reacted. That was Lena, always calm, always steady, always reliable. One particular week had been harder than usual. The company was preparing for a big project and everyone was stressed. Meetings ran late into the evening. Emails piled up endlessly and the pressure felt almost unbearable. Lena stayed late every day, sometimes until the office lights flickered and the cleaners began pushing their carts down the hall. She didn't complain. She didn't need praise. She just made sure everything was done correctly. She even stayed late one night to fix a problem with a report that had been messed up by a coworker who was too busy talking on the phone to notice. Despite her effort, Lena was rarely thanked. Most people didn't even realize how much work she did, how much she sacrificed, how quietly she handled every small crisis without drama. She had no friends at the office, not because she was unfriendly, but because she simply didn't have time to socialize. Every break she took, she spent thinking about her grandmother or planning how to manage the next day's work without falling behind. Then came the day she decided to leave. It was not sudden, though it might have seemed so to others. She had been thinking about it for weeks, maybe months, weighing every option, wondering how she could manage without this job, but finally deciding that she could not continue in the same pattern anymore. She didn't want to leave out of anger, nor out of frustration with her coworkers. She didn't want to make a scene. She simply handed in her resignation. The resignation letter was brief, polite, and simple. It said nothing about her struggles, nothing about the late nights, nothing about the sacrifices she had made. It simply said she was leaving, and it thanked the company for the opportunity to work there. She slipped the letter onto her manager's desk, gave a small nod, and quietly walked away. No one saw it coming. No one stopped her. She didn't cry, didn't shout, didn't demand explanations. She just left as quietly as she had existed among them. Her manager was surprised but didn't pay much attention. She was just one of many employees who moved in and out of the office. The coworkers barely noticed her absence except for a few, who realized that the files she had carefully organized were now in disarray. Some of them grumbled that nobody knew where anything was anymore. But life went on. The office moved on. Lena's quiet presence was gone and nobody thought much about it. The CEO of the company, Ethan, did notice, though he did not immediately act. He had seen her working in the office many times, though he rarely spoke to her directly. She was not someone who demanded attention. She was not someone who sought praise. But she had a kind of presence that left a quiet mark. She was reliable. She was thorough. She never made mistakes that could cost the company money or reputation. She was the kind of employee every CEO wished existed, even if he didn't know her name. It was only after she left that Ethan began to realize what her absence meant. He noticed the small gaps in the office, the tiny mistakes that began to appear in reports, the confusion in scheduling meetings, and the files that nobody could find. It was subtle, but it was there, and for the first time he wondered about the quiet girl who had walked away. Who was she? Where had she gone? What kind of life did she have outside the walls of this office that she had served so faithfully? Lena, meanwhile, was not resting. Her life outside the office was full of responsibility, full of struggle, and full of challenges that were not visible to anyone else. She spent her days caring for her grandmother, making sure she had her medicine, her food, her comfort. She ran errands, managed bills, and made sure that the small room they lived in was warm and clean. Every step she took was measured, every decision weighed carefully. She had learned long ago that life would not give her chances freely, and if she wanted to survive, she had to plan, work, and sacrifice without complaint. Her sacrifices extended beyond her own family, though. There was a baby she had found abandoned months ago, a tiny child left on the steps of a hospital with no one to care for her. Lena had taken her in secretly without telling anyone, without asking for help, without expecting recognition. She had cared for the baby as best she could, feeding her, comforting her, bathing her, and protecting her from harm. The baby was fragile, sometimes sick, sometimes crying through the night, but Lena never faltered. She managed her time between the office, her grandmother, and the baby, always quietly, always alone. This secret life was the reason she had decided to leave her job. She could not continue balancing everything and still keep the baby safe. She could not continue sacrificing her own health and well-being while also supporting her family and caring for a child that was not hers by birth but hers by heart. The office had been kind in some ways, but it was no longer sustainable. Her resignation was not an escape. It was a necessary step toward survival, toward responsibility, toward protecting the little life she had taken under her wing. Even as she left, Lena was careful. She did not want to cause panic, draw attention, or create problems for anyone else. She knew that if she left quietly, life would continue around her and she could focus on what mattered most without unnecessary obstacles. She walked out of the office with no fanfare, no dramatic farewell, just a simple goodbye. Her footsteps were soft on the carpet, but the weight she carried was immense, heavier than most people could imagine. The office returned to its usual rhythm. Meetings went on, deadlines were met, projects moved forward, but somewhere deep in the office files, in the small, unremarkable desk that she had occupied, traces of Lena's work remained. The schedules she had carefully arranged, the reports she had meticulously prepared, the organization she had brought to chaos, these were small marks of her presence, quietly shaping the company even after she had gone. No one knew the full story of her life outside those walls, not the struggles, not the sacrifices, not the hidden acts of courage. And Lena wanted it that way. She did not seek recognition or sympathy. She only sought to do what was right, to protect those who could not protect themselves and to carry her burdens with dignity. She had always believed that life was not about being noticed. It was about doing what needed to be done, quietly, without applause. As she walked away from the office for the last time, Lena felt a strange mixture of relief and fear. Relief that she could finally focus on what mattered most, on her family, on the baby, on survival. Fear that the challenges ahead were greater than anything she had faced before. But she held her head high, walked steadily, and did not look back. The world behind her continued on, unaware of the quiet girl who had worked tirelessly, sacrificed endlessly, and left without a word, leaving a mark that would only be noticed much later. In that quiet step away, there was courage. There was strength. There was an unspoken story of love, responsibility, and resilience. Lena's departure was more than a resignation. It was a choice to protect life, to care for others, and to survive with dignity. And though no one in the office knew it yet, her story was only beginning. A few days after Lena left the office, Ethan, the CEO, was reviewing his emails in his office when his phone rang. The call was from a hospital he had never personally contacted before. A nurse's urgent voice asked if he was aware that his number was listed as an emergency contact for a baby in critical condition. Ethan froze. The words didn't make sense at first. How could he be an emergency contact for a child he had never seen, never known? "Excuse me?" he asked carefully. "Are you sure you have the right number?" "Yes, sir," the nurse replied. "It's right here on our form. Name, phone number, and your workplace are all listed. We need someone to come in immediately for paperwork and decisions." The baby's condition is serious. Ethan's mind raced. He had never met this child, and yet someone had trusted him enough to list him as the emergency contact. He asked for the baby's name and the details, and when the nurse read the form aloud, his confusion deepened. The name of the person who had registered him as contact was Lena, the quiet assistant who had resigned last week. He sat back in his chair, stunned. He remembered her now, the quiet girl who had worked tirelessly without seeking recognition. She was polite, diligent, and always calm. But how could she possibly have trusted him with something so important? He barely knew her. He had exchanged only a few words with her in passing. Yet somehow she had believed he could be trusted to protect a child's life. Ethan didn't waste any time. He drove straight to the hospital, his mind filled with questions. When he arrived, a nurse guided him to a small room where a tiny baby lay in an incubator, hooked up to machines, struggling to breathe. The sight took his breath away. The baby was fragile, no older than a few months, with soft, pale skin and small, delicate features. He could see the faint rise and fall of her chest, the struggle in her tiny body, and a rush of concern hit him hard. The nurse explained everything as Ethan listened in disbelief. Lena had brought the baby to the hospital a few weeks ago and had been caring for her quietly. The child had been found abandoned with no family to claim her, no one to care for her. Lena had taken the baby in, nurtured her, and provided everything she could. The hospital staff described Lena as brave and resourceful, but also exhausted and stretched to her limits. Somehow she had managed to survive, care for her grandmother, and care for this baby at the same time. Ethan felt a mixture of awe and guilt. He had noticed her in the office as a diligent worker, but he had no idea of the life she led outside those walls. He had not known about her struggles, her sacrifices, or the quiet heroism in her actions. She had faced enormous hardships, yet she never complained, never sought help, and never asked for recognition. She had carried the weight of responsibilities most adults could barely imagine. And now she had entrusted him with her greatest concern, a tiny, defenseless baby. The nurse handed him a note Lena had left with the baby. It was simple, written in clear, neat handwriting. "Please protect her," it said. Nothing more. No explanation, no details, just a simple request. Ethan held the note in his hand, feeling the weight of its meaning. This quiet, unassuming girl had trusted him with life itself. He looked at the baby again, feeling a rush of emotions he hadn't anticipated. There was fear, because he had no idea how to care for a child in this situation. There was awe, because he had never seen such courage in someone so young. And there was a deep respect for Lena, whose quiet strength had left an impression far beyond her work at the office. She had taken on the impossible and done it with grace, and now she had trusted him to continue her protection if anything went wrong. Ethan asked the nurse more questions about the baby's condition, the care she had received, and the steps required to ensure her safety. She explained that Lena had been providing care as best she could, but she had been sick, tired, and overwhelmed. The baby was stable for now, but she needed proper attention, regular feeding, and medical monitoring. It was clear that without Lena's dedication, the child might not have survived. Ethan sat quietly, absorbing every word. He felt a surge of determination. Lena had trusted him. He could not fail her. He would do whatever was necessary to ensure the baby's safety, no matter how difficult it might be. He knew he could not replace Lena, but he could be there to provide support, stability, and protection. He had no idea where she was now, whether she was safe or struggling, but he could at least honor her trust by caring for the child she loved so dearly. He spent hours at the hospital that day, asking questions, reviewing medical records, and making arrangements for the baby's immediate needs. Nurses and doctors were impressed with his commitment, noting that most people would have been overwhelmed, intimidated, or unwilling to step in. But Ethan remained calm, focused, and determined. He felt a connection to Lena, even though she was not there, and he knew he had a responsibility that went far beyond his usual duties as a CEO. As he left the hospital that evening, he realized something else. Lena's quiet life had been filled with courage, love, and sacrifice that no one at the office had ever seen. She had worked long hours, cared for a sick grandmother, and nurtured a fragile child, all without recognition, without help, and without complaint. She had walked away from the office quietly, but her actions had left an indelible mark. She had inspired him, challenged him, and reminded him of the unseen struggles that people carry every day. Ethan also realized that he needed to find her. He could not simply care for the baby and ignore the woman who had trusted him so deeply. He needed to know she was safe, that she was healthy and that she was getting the support she deserved. He began to ask questions about where she might have gone, speaking with nurses, checking her last known addresses, and even reviewing office records. Every small clue brought him closer to understanding the life she had led and the sacrifices she had made. Meanwhile, Lena continued her life quietly. She had not expected anyone from the office or anywhere else to follow her. She was focused entirely on survival, on her grandmother, and on the baby she had taken under her wing. She worried constantly about what might happen to the child if something went wrong. Every day brought new challenges, from finding enough food and medicine to making sure the baby stayed warm, healthy, and safe. Her own health suffered because she neglected herself, but she did not complain. She could not. Her life had no room for complaints, only solutions. The first few nights after leaving the office were the hardest. She had no savings, barely enough food, and the baby's health was fragile. She spent sleepless nights rocking the child, singing softly and praying for her safety. Every small cry from the baby made her heart race. Every cough made her stomach tighten. Yet she persevered. She had promised herself that she would do everything possible to protect this life, and she would not break that promise. When Ethan eventually found a small lead about her location, he acted carefully. He didn't want to alarm her, upset her, or make her feel uncomfortable. He simply wanted to make sure she was safe and to ensure that the baby had proper care. He spoke to neighbors, asked discreet questions, and followed every small clue. His respect for Lena grew with every step, as he realized that the challenges she had faced were far greater than anything he could have imagined. She had carried the weight of responsibility, hardship, and danger quietly without asking for help, without seeking recognition, and without faltering. By the time he finally found her, Lena was weak from exhaustion but still determined. She looked small and fragile, but there was a strength in her eyes that could not be ignored. She had faced hardships that would have broken many people, yet she remained steadfast, focused entirely on the baby's well-being. Seeing her like this, Ethan felt a deep admiration and a sense of urgency. He knew he had to step in to help, to provide support, and to honor the trust she had placed in him. The reunion was quiet. Lena did not shout, cry, or make a scene. She was surprised, of course, and wary, but Ethan simply reassured her that he had not come to judge, criticize, or interfere. He had come to help. Slowly, cautiously, she allowed him into her world, letting him see the challenges, the exhaustion, and the dedication she had poured into caring for the baby. It was a delicate balance at first. Lena was proud, independent, and wary of accepting help. She had survived alone for so long that letting someone else in felt strange. But Ethan was patient. He did not pressure her. He did not demand anything. He simply offered support, guidance, and care. Over time, she began to trust him, realizing that he genuinely wanted to help, not to interfere or take control. By the end of part 2, Ethan had begun to understand Lena's life in ways he could never have imagined. He realized that her quiet resignation from the office had been more than a choice. It had been a necessity. He understood her courage, her sacrifices, and her selflessness. And most importantly, he felt the weight of her trust, knowing that she had listed him as the emergency contact for the most precious life she had chosen to protect. Lena had walked away quietly, but in doing so, she had left a mark that changed someone else's life forever. Ethan could not undo her struggles, but he could honor her trust, care for the baby, and perhaps help Lena find the support she had long deserved. And so began the next chapter of their lives, an unexpected bond, built on trust, courage, and the quiet strength of a woman who had given everything without asking for anything in return. Lena's life had always been quiet, private, and full of responsibilities that no one else could see. The world outside her small apartment, the office she had left behind, and even the bustling city streets were oblivious to the struggles she carried each day. The baby, however, was her center. Every thought, every step, every decision revolved around keeping that small, fragile life safe. And now, with Ethan's careful attention, there was a new presence in her life, someone who had the ability to protect the child in ways Lena sometimes could not. At first, she watched him cautiously. Ethan was careful, patient, and gentle with the baby. He asked questions, learned quickly, and never acted like he knew better than she did. It was strange for her to see someone else so, caring for the child she had nurtured for months. She had done everything alone, From the middle of the night feedings to soothing cries when the baby couldn't stop crying, to finding medicine when her tiny body became sick, letting someone else into that world felt foreign, almost uncomfortable, but she could not deny a small sense of relief. There were moments she could finally breathe, knowing that the baby's safety was no longer resting entirely on her shoulders. Ethan, meanwhile, was learning about the life Lena had been leading quietly. He had known her as a competent, polite, quiet assistant at the office, but what he discovered in these days was a life filled with hardship and courage. He learned that her grandmother was chronically ill, requiring attention and medication daily. He learned that Lena had lived on the edge of poverty for years, working extra jobs just to keep food on the table, to pay bills, to make sure the small apartment they shared did not fall apart. And he learned about the baby, a tiny abandoned child who had become Lena's world, who had her full heart, her every effort, and every bit of her strength. The baby, though fragile, had already been through so much in her short life. She had been abandoned, left without a parent, without anyone to care for her. Lena had found her by accident sitting on the steps of a hospital. The child had been cold, hungry, and crying, and Lena had taken her in without a second thought. She had no idea what challenges lay ahead. She had no idea how much it would cost, how much effort it would require, or how many sleepless nights she would endure. She had only known that she could not leave the child alone. Ethan listened carefully as Lena recounted small details about her life with the baby. There were nights when the baby cried so much that Lena's own body ached from exhaustion. There were days when she had no money for proper formula and had to stretch what she had, carefully measuring it to ensure the child had enough to eat. There were moments when the baby became ill, and Lena had no one to turn to, no family, no friends, only her own determination to keep going. The story was heartbreaking, but it was also full of courage. Lena had faced situations that would have overwhelmed most adults. She had fought to keep the baby alive, to provide care without recognition or help, and she had done it quietly, without complaint. Her life had been one of constant struggle, and yet she had never given up. Ethan felt both admiration and guilt. He had known her as a quiet, unassuming employee, but he had never imagined the hidden battles she had fought. He also began to understand why she had resigned. Lena had tried to balance her job, her grandmother's care, and the baby's needs, but the pressure had been too great. She had made the choice to leave the office quietly, without explanation, to focus on what mattered most. And now, seeing her struggle in person, he realized how brave she had been. Walking away from a stable job, a steady paycheck, and a predictable life to protect a child she had chosen was not an easy decision. It required courage, selflessness, and strength. The days that followed were a delicate dance of trust and patience. Lena had to let Ethan help, and he had to earn her confidence. She was independent, proud, and wary of allowing someone else to share the responsibility she had carried alone for so long. Ethan was patient. He did not rush her. He did not interfere unnecessarily, and he never made her feel judged. Slowly, carefully, Lena allowed him into her world, letting him assist with the baby's care, offering suggestions on food, medicine, and comfort. Ethan began to notice the little things Lena did without thinking, how she would hum softly to calm the baby, how she would anticipate her needs before she cried, how she had created a rhythm of care that had kept the child alive. It was not something anyone could learn overnight. It was instinct, courage, and love combined. He felt a deep respect for her, and a sense of responsibility that grew with every passing day. Despite the baby's fragile health, Lena had created a life filled with small routines and careful planning. She had a strict schedule for feeding, sleeping, and medical checks. She had managed to keep the apartment warm, clean, and safe despite her own exhaustion. She had little money, but she made every penny count. Food, medicine, blankets, and small toys were prioritized, and she often went without herself, so the baby could have enough. Watching her, Ethan realized that true strength was quiet. It was not in shouting, demanding attention, or showing off accomplishments. True strength, he saw, was in the small, unseen acts of love and care that Lena performed every day. One evening, as the baby slept, Lena sat quietly in a chair, her body trembling from fatigue. Ethan watched her from a distance, unsure whether to interrupt. She looked small, fragile, and yet there was a fire in her eyes that refused to be extinguished. Finally, he spoke softly, not wanting to startle her. "You've done an incredible job," he said. "I can't imagine how hard it's been." Lena looked at him briefly, then back at the sleeping child. "It's just what had to be done," she replied quietly. "No one else could do it. I had to." Ethan nodded, understanding that her humility was part of her character. She did not seek praise, she did not want recognition, but he wanted her to know that her efforts mattered. "I know," he said, "and I want to help. I want to make sure you don't have to do this alone anymore." She hesitated, looking unsure. Accepting help had never been easy for her. She was used to managing everything herself, solving every problem on her own. Letting someone in felt strange, almost uncomfortable, but the exhaustion, the constant pressure, and the small moments of fear made her realize that maybe, just maybe, accepting help was not weakness. It was survival. Over the next few days, Ethan helped with everything he could, arranging proper medical care, bringing in supplies, ensuring there was nutritious food, and making sure Lena had time to rest. Slowly, she began to let herself relax at least a little. The baby responded to the stability, growing stronger and healthier. She smiled more, cried less, and began to thrive. And Lena, who had been living on the edge of exhaustion and fear, felt a small, cautious relief. Through it all, Ethan learned more about her past. He discovered that Lena had faced poverty and hardship from a young age. She had cared for her grandmother, worked multiple jobs, and always prioritized others over herself. She had never asked for help, never sought recognition, and never complained about the hardships she endured. Her life had been one of constant struggle, and yet she had never given up. Every small act of kindness, every moment of patience, every sacrifice had built a quiet, powerful story of courage. It became clear to Ethan that Lena's life had been shaped by responsibility, love, and perseverance. She had faced challenges most people could not imagine, and yet she had carried on quietly without anyone knowing. She had taken a tiny, abandoned child under her care and nurtured her as if she were her own. She had sacrificed her own health, her own comfort, and her own time to ensure the child's survival, and she had done it without complaint, without recognition, and without expectation. Ethan felt a deep respect and admiration for her. He realized that her quiet resignation from the office had been more than a personal choice. It had been a necessity. She had left not because she was unhappy with the office, but because she had to prioritize what mattered most, protecting a life that depended entirely on her. Her courage was not loud or flashy. It was quiet, steady, and unwavering, and it was exactly the kind of strength that changed lives. By the end of Part 3, Lena had begun to accept Ethan's support more fully. She still remained cautious and independent, but she recognized that she did not have to face every challenge alone anymore. The baby was healthier, safer, and thriving under the combined care of Lena and Ethan. And Ethan, who had once seen her only as a quiet, diligent employee, now understood the true depth of her courage, the extent of her sacrifices, and the strength of her heart. Lena's life, once hidden and unnoticed, was beginning to be seen, not for her work at the office, but for the incredible, selfless acts of love that she had performed quietly every day. And while she still carried the weight of responsibility, she now had someone to share it with, someone who could honor her trust and help protect the life she had devoted herself to saving. Her quiet life, once filled only with struggle, was slowly opening into a new chapter, one where her courage, love, and determination were finally recognized, not by the world at large, but by someone who truly understood. And in the quiet moments, as she watched the baby sleep peacefully and felt Ethan's steady presence nearby, Lena began to allow herself a small, cautious hope for the future, a hope she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time. Ethan could not sleep that night. The picture of the little baby lying in the hospital bed kept flashing in his mind. The nurse's words, "Lena left your name as the emergency contact," kept echoing again and again. It made no sense to him. He wasn't related to her, had barely spoken more than a few polite words at work, and yet she trusted him enough to leave his name for something so serious. The next morning, he sat at his desk, staring at Lena's old employee file. There wasn't much there. She had joined 2 years ago, had never taken a day off except when her grandmother passed away, and her salary had always been transferred to the same small bank account. No family listed, no close friends mentioned, just one emergency contact, her grandmother, who has now gone. He sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Why would she choose me?" he whispered under his breath. He decided he couldn't just let this go. Something in him needed to understand her. Maybe it was guilt for not noticing her struggles earlier, or maybe it was curiosity mixed with worry. Whatever it was, he felt a strange responsibility now, not just for the baby, but for Lena too. He called the HR department and asked if they had any forwarding address for her. The HR officer hesitated. "Sir, she didn't leave a new address. Just said she was moving out of her old place. Did she mention where she was going?" Ethan asked. "No, but one of her co-workers said she talked about a small area near the west end of the city. A cheaper neighborhood." Ethan wrote that down. It wasn't much, but it was a start. That evening after work, he drove to that part of town. The streets there were narrow, lined with small houses and old buildings. Most shops were already closing. He parked near a small grocery store and showed Lena's photo, taken from her ID, to the shopkeeper. "Have you seen this girl before?" he asked politely. The man looked closely and nodded slowly. "Yes, I think she comes here sometimes. Always buys milk and baby food. Lives around the corner in that old blue building. But I haven't seen her for a few days." Ethan thanked him and walked toward the building. It was worn out, with faded paint and rusted balconies. The hallway smelled of old wood and laundry soap. He climbed up the narrow staircase until he reached the third floor. There were only 2 doors there. He knocked on the first one and an old lady opened it slightly. "Sorry to bother you, ma'am. I'm looking for someone named Lena. She used to live here, I think?" The woman nodded. "Yes, she lived next door. Sweet girl. Always quiet, always helping everyone. She moved out last week. Said she couldn't afford rent anymore. Poor thing looked tired. She had a little baby with her." Ethan's heart sank. "Do you know where she went?" The old woman shook her head. "She said she was going to stay somewhere safe for a while. That's all I know." He thanked her and left, feeling a mix of frustration and concern. As he stepped outside, he noticed a small community shelter sign across the street. Something told him to check there. Inside the shelter, a kind woman at the desk greeted him. "Good evening, sir. How can I help you?" He showed her the same photo. "I'm looking for this girl." "Her name is Lena." The woman's expression softened. "Yes, she's here, but she's been very sick. She came in a few days ago with a fever. We tried to take her to the hospital, but she refused. Said she didn't have money and didn't want to be a burden." Ethan felt a wave of relief knowing she was alive, followed by guilt that she had ended up in such a state. "Can I see her, please?" he asked quietly. The woman nodded and led him through a hallway lined with small beds. The shelter was clean but simple. In one corner, under a thin blanket, Lena lay asleep. Her face looked pale, her lips dry. She looked weaker than he remembered. Her hands were thin and her clothes looked worn out. He stood there for a moment, unsure what to say. It was strange, seeing someone who used to walk quietly past his office door now lying there like this. She had worked in his building, yet he had never really seen her until now. The woman at the desk whispered, "She needs rest, but you can wait till she wakes up." Ethan nodded and sat quietly on a nearby chair. For the next hour, he watched her sleep, listening to the soft hum of the ceiling fan. Every now and then she coughed lightly. Finally, her eyes opened. When she saw him, she froze in confusion. "Sir?" she whispered weakly. He smiled gently. "Hi, Lena. I didn't mean to surprise you. I came because the hospital called me about the baby." Her eyes widened and she slowly sat up, though she looked dizzy. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "I didn't know who else to put. I just wanted someone kind." Ethan shook his head. "You don't need to apologize. I just wanted to make sure you're okay." Tears filled her eyes. "The baby. Is she all right?" "Yes," he said softly. "She's stable now. The doctor said she'll recover soon." Lena let out a shaky breath of relief. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan asked gently, "Why didn't you tell anyone what was going on? Why didn't you ask for help?" She looked down. "I didn't think anyone would care. I've always managed on my own. People don't listen to people like me." Her words hit him hard. He had walked past her countless times in the office, too busy to notice. "You're wrong," he said quietly. "Someone should have noticed." "I should have." She shook her head faintly. "You were kind. That's why I chose your name. I thought if something happened to me, you wouldn't ignore the baby." Ethan looked at her for a long moment, speechless. He could see how much she had been through, how she had carried so much alone. "You need proper care," he finally said. "You can't stay here like this. Let me help." She hesitated, shaking her head. "I can't accept charity. It's not charity, he said softly. It's what anyone decent would do. You've done more good than many people who have much more. She stayed silent, her eyes glistening. He could tell she wasn't used to kindness. After a moment, she whispered, "All right, just until I get better." Ethan arranged for her to be admitted to the hospital that same night. The shelter worker helped gather her few belongings, a worn-out bag, a baby blanket, and a few folded clothes. He stayed with her through the admission process, talking quietly to the doctor about her condition. Once she was settled in her hospital room, Lena looked up at him. "Why are you helping me?" she asked softly. He smiled faintly. "Because you helped someone else when no one asked you to. You saved a baby's life, Lena. The least I can do is make sure you're safe now." She looked away, trying to hide her tears. "I just couldn't leave her on the street," she said. "When I found her, she was crying in a box behind the old building. I told myself I'd take care of her for a few days. But days became weeks. I loved her too much to let her go." Ethan felt his throat tighten. "You did something truly good. You didn't walk away." For the next few days, he visited her regularly. He brought her food from her favorite bakery near the office and updates from the hospital about the baby. Slowly, her health began to improve. The color returned to her cheeks and she started smiling again. Small, shy smiles that looked like tiny rays of sunlight breaking through clouds. During one of his visits, she said quietly, "You know, I used to see you in the office and wonder how someone could look so calm all the time. I thought people like you had no worries." He chuckled softly. "You'd be surprised. Everyone has their own battles." Lena nodded, looking thoughtful. "Maybe. I guess I just thought. People like me and people like you lived in different worlds." Ethan looked at her with a faint smile. "Maybe we did. But now those worlds have met." She smiled for the first time without holding back. It was gentle, pure, and full of quiet gratitude. When she was finally discharged, Ethan arranged a small apartment for her near the hospital. He didn't tell her it was his arrangement. He said a friend had an empty place and offered it for free until she got back on her feet. Lena hesitated but agreed. As she stood by the window of her new place, watching the sunset, she whispered, "Maybe kindness still exists in this world." Ethan, standing at the door, said softly, "It always does. Sometimes it just hides behind busy faces." The days slowly turned into weeks and things started to settle into a quiet rhythm. Lena's strength was returning, though she still looked fragile at times. She had moved into the small apartment Ethan had arranged, and for the first time in a long while she slept peacefully through the night. No constant worry about rent, no skipped meals, and no crying baby to comfort alone. The baby, who had spent almost 2 weeks in the hospital, was finally discharged. Ethan personally went to bring her to the new apartment. He carried the little girl carefully, wrapped in a soft blanket while Lena waited anxiously by the door. When she saw the baby again, her eyes filled with tears. She held her close, whispering softly, "I missed you so much." Ethan stood quietly watching the scene. There was something pure about it. The way Lena held the baby, the way she smiled despite her exhaustion. He had seen countless business meetings, contracts, and deals, but none of those moments had ever felt this meaningful. He brought some baby supplies with him, a crib, milk, and clothes. Lena tried to protest. "You've already done too much. I don't want to take advantage of your kindness." But Ethan shook his head with a small smile. "You're not taking advantage. You're just accepting help that's freely given. You've done your part, now let others do theirs." Lena looked down, then smiled softly. "Thank you. I don't know how to repay you." "You don't need to," he said. "Just take care of her. That's more than enough." Days went by, and Ethan often visited in the evenings after work. He would sometimes bring groceries or food, but mostly he came to check on them. The baby had begun to recognize him and would smile every time he entered the room. Lena found herself laughing more often too, something she hadn't done in months. One evening, as they sat by the small kitchen table, Lena asked, "Why did you help me, really? You could have walked away after that first day." Ethan thought for a moment before answering. "Because sometimes life gives us chances to do something good, something that actually matters. I've spent years chasing success, but I never stopped to look at the people around me. You reminded me that real strength isn't loud, it's quiet, and it keeps going no matter what." Lena smiled. Faintly, her eyes glistening. "I used to think kindness was a weakness. that people only cared when they wanted something back. But you proved me wrong. He looked at her gently. Maybe we both learned something from this. She nodded, holding the baby close. Maybe we did. Over the next few months, Lena's life slowly began to rebuild. She got stronger, both in body and spirit. Ethan had offered her a new position in the company, not as an assistant, but as a part of the community outreach team he was starting. It was a new project aimed at helping underprivileged families and single parents. When he first told her, she hesitated. "I don't think I'm the right person for that," she said quietly. Ethan smiled. "You're exactly the right person. You know what struggle feels like. You know what it means to care when no one else does. That's what makes you perfect for it." She finally agreed, and soon enough she was back in the building she once left in silence. But this time she wasn't the shy assistant in the corner. People noticed her now, not because of her title, but because of her quiet confidence. She worked with passion, always thinking about how to make others' lives easier. Ethan often watched from his office window as she moved around the department, guiding her team, smiling at everyone she met. There was something peaceful about her presence, like she had found her place again. One afternoon, as she sat in his office going over reports, Ethan asked, "Do you ever regret leaving that day?" She looked up thoughtfully. "No," she said softly. "I think I needed to lose everything to understand what really matters. Back then, I was running away from pain. Now I'm walking toward purpose." He nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. As weeks turned into months, they both became a quiet part of each other's lives. It wasn't rushed or dramatic. It was simply two people who had crossed paths for a reason, both changed by what they found. Sometimes after work, Ethan would visit Lena and the baby. They would sit on the floor, playing with toys or laughing at the baby's little expressions. Lena often caught herself thinking about how strange life was, how something that began with pain had led her to peace. One evening, as rain poured outside, Ethan came by with a small box. He set it on the table and said with a shy smile, "I thought she might like this." Lena opened it and found a tiny silver bracelet with the baby's name engraved on it. She ran her fingers over the delicate letters and whispered, "It's beautiful." Ethan shrugged lightly, "Just a small reminder that she's cared for." She smiled warmly. "Thank you. For everything." He looked at her, his eyes kind but serious. "You don't have to thank me anymore. You've done more for me than you realize." Lena tilted her head, puzzled. "How?" He leaned back, thinking. "You reminded me what humanity feels like. I had forgotten that success isn't just about numbers or growth charts. It's about people, about doing something that lasts beyond a paycheck." Lena looked down, her voice soft. "I think we all need someone to remind us sometimes." The rain kept falling and the room felt warm and calm. The baby slept soundly in her crib, her small hand gripping the edge of her blanket. It was one of those rare moments where everything felt still, as if time itself had stopped to let them breathe. Over the next few years, their bond only grew stronger. The baby learned to walk, then talk, and Ethan became uncle in her small, innocent voice. He would sometimes take her to the park on weekends, letting Lena rest or catch up on her work. People often assumed they were a small family, and though neither of them corrected it, neither minded. Lena's work at the company became well known. Her compassion and dedication inspired others. She often spoke softly to new employees who struggled, telling them, "Don't give up. Even the smallest kindness can change someone's life." Ethan watched her with quiet pride. He had built many things in his career, but helping her rebuild her life felt like his most meaningful accomplishment. One evening, as they sat on a park bench watching the sunset, Lena said, "Do you ever think things happen for a reason?" Ethan smiled faintly. "I didn't used to, but now I do." She looked ahead at the sky turning orange and gold. "That day when I wrote your name as the emergency contact, I didn't know why. I just felt like it was right. Maybe it was fate's way of leading us here." He nodded, glancing at her. "Maybe sometimes the quietest choices are the ones that change everything." The baby, now a little older, ran toward them holding a small flower she had picked from the grass. She handed it to Lena with a giggle, then looked up at Ethan and reached out her tiny hand. He smiled, took her hand, and the three of them sat there as the sun dipped below the horizon. There was no grand ending, no sudden twist. Just peace, the kind that comes after a long storm. Lena still lived simply, still carried humility in every step. But now she had something she never had before: security, purpose, and love that asked for nothing in return. Ethan continued his work, but he did it differently now. His company started new programs to help struggling families inspired by Lena's story. He never told anyone the full story, only saying, "Once someone reminded me what kindness really means." In time, people around him noticed the change. He smiled more, listened more, and treated everyone with the same quiet respect he once overlooked. Lena often said life had given her a second chance. But the truth was she had given Ethan one too. Years later, when the baby started school, Lena wrote a small note and placed it in her daughter's bag. It said, "Be kind. It's the quietest way to change the world." And somewhere deep inside she knew kindness had changed hers too.